Hey, seventh graders, Mr. Ayler again with another one of your flip lessons. Today we're going to be working on number 32, which is the three L's, land, liberty, and livelihood. Should already be in your interactive notebook. Real quick, fill in the blank. We're going to go from what it means to impact on the colonies, back and forth, kind of like this, all the way down. All right, without further ado, let's go. All right, so three L's, land. What does it mean? Colonists wanted lands of their own. In England, okay, so we're going to be focused on the English colonies, the ones that we put in our interactive notebook today on our map, the three colonial regions. In England, wealth was tied up in land. So if you were super duper wealthy, you owned a lot of land. We talked about there was a small group of people in England at the time that were super duper wealthy, and pretty much everybody else was kind of like a working poor type situation. So if you wanted to own land, if you wanted to own wealth, the only place for you to go was the colonies. There was, I mean, it seemed to the English colonists that this land was just, it didn't stop. It was there. They couldn't really comprehend how much land the colonies had to offer. Why would they want to do this? Because they wanted to establish farms and businesses of their own. Many of these folks who were coming over, they didn't have their own farm, but they worked on the farm. They didn't have their own bakery. They didn't have their own shipbuilding business. They didn't have their own trading business, but they worked for one and they wanted to be able to create their own. And the place for that was going to be in the colonies because it gave it that opportunity. Land was cheap, land was plentiful. It was something that they could get their hands on that they could not do back in England. So, impact in the colonies. All right, we're going to focus on the middle and the southern colonies for this one. The breadbasket colonies are going to be focused on farming. They're going to be farming those grains, those wheats, those oats, those barleys. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania are really going to be focused on growing those types of crops. Down in the southern plantations, they're going to be using slave labor used on plantations to grow cash crops, cotton. Tobacco was the big one for the first part of the colonies. Cotton is going to come in a little bit later with a pretty key invention. Indigo, rice, these types of crops were grown throughout the South. Now, down in the South, you'd get a lot more larger plantations. Not everybody owned slaves down the South, but the big plantations, they owned a lot. In the middle counties, not a lot of slavery going on there. Some, but typically not on your farms where you're producing uh, the grains that they produced in the middle colonies. Livelihood. Simply put, they're looking for a better life. All right. If we talked about this in class, who's more likely to leave somebody in a good situation in England or somebody in a bad situation? Most folks coming over from England were not in the greatest of situations in England and were looking for that new opportunity, that new way to kind of say, hey, let me maybe start over again. Let me start something new. Let me start something fresh, see what I can do. This was a way for them to create wealth, right? They could create their own business. We just talked about with land. They could create their own farms. They could create their own trade. This wasn't something, not saying that it wasn't possible in England, but it was very, 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 very. How many varies can I get in there? It was very, very difficult. There wasn't a lot of what we called upward mobility. If you were born poor, you probably stayed poor. If you were rich, you were probably going to stay rich, and you're going to stay that way for generations. Not saying it didn't change, but it was very, very difficult to make any changes. What did this mean for the colonies? Well, in New England, they were focusing on trading, shipbuilding, and fishing. Why? Because that was what the geography of their land said. There was some farming there, but there was not a large scale. We're going to farm cash crops in New England because they had poor rocky soil and they had a short growing season. What's the livelihood going to be for the folks in the middle colonies? We just talked about that. They're going to be farming grains. They're going to be looking at those opportunities to farm wheat, barley, oats, things that we're going to use to create flour to make bread. That's why they're called the bread basket colonies. They basically were feeding, really at some points, lots of parts of the world with the amount of grain that was coming out of the middle colonies. And then the southern colonies are going to be farming cash crops. There's going to be a need for that slave trade to benefit the colonies in the South. Okay, finally, we're going to talk about liberty. Colonists were looking for freedom, all right? Freedom politically, freedom socially, freedom economically, to kind of do what they want. And really, at first, a lot of this freedom is going to be social and economic. It is not going to be more towards the political, but it's going to get that way a little bit later. The first colonial groups that are kind of coming over are looking for those social and or economic opportunities that just were not available in England during the 16, 1700s. So New England, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this. Ooh, let me get out of the way so you can see. There we go. New England is going to be the Puritans. Their church is going to be dominating the political and social rules of the colonies. They basically, with their name Puritan, if it wasn't in the Bible, you couldn't do it, and that rubbed people in England the wrong way. And so one of the things England was doing is there was a lot of these groups, the Puritans, the Pilgrims, for example, were kind of an offshoot of the Puritans. Any of these groups that they particularly didn't like that were being rather bothersome in England, hey, there's the colonies and there's a bunch of new land. Why don't you go over there and do your crazy religious practices and things like that? And that was what happened for the early colonies, for a lot of colonies, particularly in New England, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Maryland, colonies like that were places where with people that England didn't really want in England. In the middle colonies, we're going to talk about all these folks more in depth, but this is kind of just an introduction. In the middle colonies was the Quakers. William Penn was given the colony of Pennsylvania. They wanted to be able to practice their religion pretty freely. They had some insights that didn't really jive with what was happening with the King of Parliament. They didn't want to go to war. They didn't want to pay taxes. They were giving more rights to women. Women were preachers in the Quaker religion and things like that. That wasn't really going well with what was going on over in England at the time. Southern, we just talked about Maryland, was the freedom for Catholics. Also, we're going to see the first colonial assembly. The House of Burgesses is going to be established in Virginia, which is going to start to get some of those political freedoms that we talked about, but that's not going to be until kind of the middle 1600s into the 1700s. But again, in the South, we're always going to have to talk about how democratic it is. There's no freedom for slaves. They're not going to be able to vote. They're not going to be able to own property. They're not going to have any freedom to choose what they do in their everyday lives. All right, that's our flipped lesson for today. Make sure you're answering those questions. Make sure you're getting 100s. Make sure you're taking your time, because if you're not, you're going to come in and you're going to do a little check-in with me on Friday. All right, if you have any questions, as always, hit me up on Schoology. If it's something private, send me a private message. If it's something you think some of your classmates can help you with, why don't you put a little post on the message board, on the update board there on Schoology, and see if somebody can get back to you. Until next time, 7th graders, out.